and welcome back to The Independent Pianist. It is your host, Cole Anderson, as always. Judging from the title of this video, you're probably expecting that I'm going to share with you some recording of Vladimir Horowitz playing a piece by Sergei Rachmaninoff, Franz Liszt, Frédéric Chopin, or one of the other composers that he was famous for, perhaps Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto. But actually, that couldn't be farther from the truth. The recording that I've selected today doesn't even represent Horowitz in his usual capacity as a soloist. It's not very well known that Horowitz actually was a very experienced chamber musician. He did quite a bit of chamber music playing with his compatriot Nathan Milstein early on in his career, but it wasn't really part of what he normally was known for, certainly. So the recording that I've chosen is a live performance of Robert Schumann's song cycle Dichterliebe, featuring Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau. And this was a very special occasion. This was recorded in 1976 at Carnegie Hall. And it was a concert that was put together by Isaac Stern, the violinist. Apparently at the time, Stern wanted to get a very firm endowment put together that would save Carnegie Hall from any possibility of being demolished in the future. It had survived 16 years before being knocked down, largely through Stern's offices. So in this occasion, all these famous musicians got together to raise money for the hall, including Leonard Bernstein, Vladimir Horowitz, Mstislav Rostropovich, Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, Yehudi Menuhin. And so you got this kind of truly once-in-a-century opportunity where Horowitz was quite willing to get together with Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau and perform this set. And actually, you know, I've always really enjoyed Horowitz's playing of Schumann's music. I think he is one of the great Schumann interpreters, along with people like Cortot, partly because there are qualities of unpredictability about Horowitz's playing, an improvisational element to his style, which actually works perfectly in tandem with what Schumann was going for in his own writing. So what do I mean by that? Well, Schumann oftentimes wrote in a way which I believe reflected performance practices of the time that would have been taken for granted. So for example, this idea that in piano playing, in romantic piano playing, the left and right hands are not always lined up. This was actually Chopin's definition, by the way, of tempo rubato, was where the left hand was actually playing in strict time, but the right hand would enter early or late, as the case may be, to introduce this kind of unpredictability to the sound, a kind of looseness to the texture. This is also something that Mozart mentioned, by the way, which I should put paid to the notion that rubato was only an invention of the 19th century. It's clear that it was used long before that, and we can even trace it all the way back to harpsichordists, and you know, great harpsichordists constantly play with their hands not aligned. It probably originated even with lute playing even farther back. But be that as it may, in Schumann we actually get constantly a very explicit kind of notation where he is attempting to show this kind of freedom in playing. And the opening of this song cycle is a great example of that, actually. If you look at the very first song, in wunderschönen, Monat Mai, you see how he has the first note enter anticipating the bass. And he continues this through this opening, even though the singer is actually singing on the downbeat, but the pianist doesn't. And it creates this wonderful kind of shifting feeling to the texture. Now, the problem that I've always had, though, when I hear most pianists trained in the 20th century or 21st century playing Schumann is that they tend to play in this very kind of strict, precise way, almost like they don't quite understand what the notation, how this kind of notation originated. They play it very exactly in time, and there's never a hint of the left and right hand not being together any other time. And to me, I think that's all wrong, because I think that Schumann is just pointing out places where this kind of effect should be extremely noticeable. He does it constantly. But the rest of the time, I think this is still just part of the style, and really it should be included as you're playing the music in general. And I've noticed this kind of straight-laced approach to playing Schumann, particularly in people who actually make it their business to do leader accompanying most of the time. I think there's sometimes a little bit of a self-effacing quality to the standard accompanist approach. Perhaps that's right, you know, you want to buoy up the soloist, you don't want to get in their way, you don't want to upstage them, definitely. But I've often noticed that I most enjoy chamber music leader, when the pianist or so-called accompanist is actually a great soloist in their own right, and when they take a very proactive part in moving the music along. And that's exactly what Horowitz does in this recording. That's exactly why I like it so much. He plays it exactly like he would play a solo piece by Schumann, only he makes room for everything that Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau needs to do as well. And you can kind of tell that it was a little bit unusual for Fischer-Dieskau to have this kind of approach, but he also kind of plays off that himself. He takes liberties and time and so forth that you don't actually hear him doing on other recordings, precisely because he has this impetus from the pianist. And since I do a lot of chamber music, and I used to do quite a bit of lieder accompanying as well, this recording was one of my big inspirations for how to really balance yourself against a singer, how you can really fully project your own ideas while leaving room for a great collaborator. So I'm going to go through some examples, and I'm even going to play some of the songs complete because they're pretty short. First, I want to start by playing a different recording for the first song, Im wunderschönen Monat Mai, in the wonderful month of May. This is a recording, again with Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, but with the German pianist Jörg Demus. And I don't mean to put Jörg Demus in the shade or demean his performances at all, because he was a wonderful, sensitive pianist and a wonderful collaborator. And this recording definitely shows a young Fischer-Dieskau in great shape, but Demus was definitely trained in that much more straight-laced kind of classical tradition. So I think that you can kind of hear what I'm talking about. When he plays this very straightforward, very direct, the hands tend to line up, and you don't really get the feeling that there's anything that special about the fact that Schumann has written certain notes to be out of sync with the bass. So let's just hear a little bit of that.
Im wunderschönen Monat Mai, als alle Knospen sprangen, da ist in meinem Herzen die Liebe aufgegangen.
Okay, so it is definitely a very beautiful recording. And now, when we look over to the Horowitz recording with Fischer-Dieskau, again from '76, the thing I want you to notice is actually, first off, the freedom that Horowitz takes with tempo and how he treats this, but also how he kind of subtly is not together with Dieskau sometimes, or the way that his left and right hands are kind of not aligning, even where Schumann hasn't necessarily written that explicitly. Also, the very free and expressive way in which he brings out these places where the left and right hand are not aligned. It's not so much that he's exactly mathematically doing the rhythm exactly as Schumann has notated it. Instead, he's taking that idea and he's kind of running with it and treating it in kind of a free flowing way. So let's hear the Horowitz version next. So it's kind of amazing, isn't it? It really sounds like an improvisation. And in certain places, like in the second full bar where he has that dotted 16th note on the 32nd note, it kind of sounds like he's just on the spot. He decided to take a little bit of extra time on that note before he moved on. It sounds just very natural and very organic the way he's doing this. And the kind of give and take of the tempo as well. You could argue maybe that it's excessive, but there's no denying that it's really inspiring Fischer-Dieskau to do some very different things, to push ahead in some places and to linger in other places. It's much less square, actually, than the version with Jörg Demus, lovely though that version also was. So again, I'm not necessarily saying that one way is better than the other, but there's definitely a difference of aesthetics here, and I think it's worthwhile to kind of examine that. Certainly for me, my money's all on this more romantic approach. I think it's really brings out the soul in this music. All right, so the next one I want to skip along to the fourth piece, and I wanted to highlight this one because it has a very interesting kind of answer back and forth between the singer and the pianist. So really, it is absolutely equal between the two parts in importance. The singer starts with the melody, and then you can see that the pianist is answering with the exact same note. So it's kind of a canon, a limited kind of canon. And this kind of back and forth continues throughout the piece. So I don't need to necessarily drive it home that most people play this in a very straightforward way and sing it in a very straightforward way without that much messing around with the rhythm. But I think it's almost kind of amazing when you listen to the Horowitz recording how much time he actually takes. Let's just hear it first, and then I'll give a few comments on that.
Wenn ich in deine Augen sehe, so schwindet
Whoa, right? Already. I just had to stop because right there at the beginning, Horowitz took so much time on that high C. Fischer-Dieskau had already started the next phrase. Obviously, he wasn't quite ready for that. I don't know how much they necessarily rehearsed this. My impression is that they just kind of threw it together, and Horowitz was just having kind of a good time experimenting and kind of improvising a little bit on the material. So there, I mean, it really is almost like a little bit of a ensemble mishap. But you'll see as they go along, Fischer-Dieskau kind of warms into the style, and they start to really communicate and make music together. So to my mind, that's not even really necessarily a bad thing. It was just Horowitz taking a risk, and after that, everything kind of starts to shape in a new direction, a very unexpected direction.
mein Leid und Weh. Doch wenn ich küsse deinen Mund, so werd ich ganz und gar gesund. Wenn ich mich lehn an deine Brust, kann's über mich wie Himmelslust. Doch wenn du sprichst, ich liebe dich, so muss ich weinen
Really marvelous. I think it's really marvelous. After that one little mishap at the beginning, they were right with each other in every little bit of time taking. And like that one spot where Fischer-Dieskau sings Ich liebe dich, I love you, and you have Horowitz kind of doing this diminished seventh arpeggio. Just time stands still. It's so incredibly gorgeous. what they came up with there. So that's exactly that kind of risk-taking. I always wish that collaborative pianists or accompanists or whatever you want to call us, I always wish that more collaborative pianists would do that kind of thing, would really take the lead to a certain degree and inspire their colleagues. I also like how big Horowitz plays in this recording oftentimes. So in the beginning of the sixth piece, Im Rhein, which is, by the way, actually a very famous poem, which has also been set by many composers, including Robert Franz and Franz Liszt. Horowitz really lays into the accompaniment, but only in such a way that will not cover Fischer-Dieskau. And I think that's actually an important thing to remember, is that you don't necessarily have to always be playing really soft when you're accompanying someone like a singer. You only have to be careful about what you play loud. In this case, he really brings out the bass. He plays the bass quite loudly, not too loud in the upper parts though, so it doesn't actually interfere with what Fischer-Dieskau is doing. Kind of hear there what I was talking about how he's really playing into the part quite a bit, much more than most collaborative pianists would. Most people play it in a much more tame kind of way, but I like that he's getting a little bit of grit in his sound, and it really seems to be encouraging the emotions that Fischer-Dieskau is getting from the text. Also, I thought it was kind of striking the way he brought out the accented notes here, when it's moving upward and it connects with the voice part. Again, something that you don't necessarily hear brought out to such an extent in every performance, but it really adds something to the total effect of the music, and it's something that Schumann actually wrote. All right, so next I'm going to go to another one of the more famous ones. This one's Ich grolle nicht, or I bear no grudge. I wanted to highlight the way in which Horowitz realizes the accompaniment. The accompaniment here is written just in straight eighth notes. And so for the majority of performances, like the one that Fischer-Dieskau did with George Demus, you'll hear the pianist actually plays very, very steady and very precise and keeps a very steady tempo with those repeated eighth notes. Let's hear a little bit of an example of that. Let's hear that earlier performance with George Demus. And we're just hearing the second half of the piece.
Und wenn das Herz auch bricht, ich sah dich ja im Traume und sah die Nacht in deines Herzens Raume und sah die Schlange, die dir am Herzen fricht. Ich sah mein Lieb, wie sehr du elend bist. Ich grolle nicht, ich grolle nicht.
So there's definitely a little bit of flexibility there in the way that George Demus is playing the accompaniment, but he's mostly responding to things that Fischer-Dieskau is doing in his part. Like when he needs a little bit of time on these last couple of lines here, he's kind of making room for that. Otherwise, he's not really doing that much. He's not really instigating very much. And it might seem like that's the obvious way to play this. I mean, you're just playing chords after all. What are you supposed to do? Well, let's take a little listen to what Horowitz does here in this same spot and just hear what kind of possibilities are there.
Ich grolle nicht, und wenn das Herz auch bricht, ich sah dich ja im Traume und sah die Nacht in deines Herzens Raume.
So as you might have heard, I mean, first off, he does do this kind of unwritten drop to piano at the beginning of the repeat of the main theme. But beyond that, as the intensity starts to build up, you'll notice that he starts to push forward a little bit with the rhythm, kind of grouping the notes a little bit together and just being on the front side of the beat oftentimes. And you can hear that this actually elicits a response from Fischer Dieskau. Far from feeling like he's being pushed, it just adds a little bit greater intensity to what Dieskau is doing. He actually seems to be kind of inspired by it and starts to push and pull a little bit more himself in response. And then you can hear at the end that Horowitz actually adds, again, an unwritten but perfectly appropriate accelerando at the end of the piece, which just seems to lift the piece from something a little bit more maudlin and sentimental to something much more angry and angsty, which I think is really what the character of this piece is supposed to be, as the singer angrily seems to be saying very angrily that he bears no grudge, but he actually, you know, his heart is breaking. Okay, so another one I wanted to go through a little bit was the ninth piece, Das ist ein Flöten und Geigen. And this one I always think is such a striking compositional idea, because in the text, the poet is listening to the wedding ceremony in the distance. You know, the woman he's in love with has married someone else, and he can hear the wedding ceremony going on. He can hear the flutes and the trumpets and the drums and so forth in the distance. So you get the sound, this kind of somewhat eerie, distant music that the pianist is playing, and the singer is kind of morosely speaking along with it. And at certain moments where the singer is talking about the trumpets blaring in the wedding band, dynamic actually changes to forte. So what usually happens here is that the singer does this change. The pianist also does a certain amount of a change in dynamic, but usually doesn't change the way they actually are playing the figuration. And as an example of that, again, I'll go back to the Jörg Demus Fischer Dieskau recording. Let's hear a little bit of the beginning of that.
Das ist ein Flöten und Geigen, Trompeten schmettern da rein, Trompeten schmettern da rein. Da tanzt wohl in der Hochzeit Reigen, die Herz allerliebste mein, die Herz allerliebste mein.
Great. So let's hear the same bit again, and I want you especially to pay attention to the parts where the music switches to forte, which is written both in the singer's part and also in the pianist's part. And notice the way that Horowitz actually changes not just the dynamics, but he changes several other things in his interpretive arsenal at this point to really make the music sound different. Let's hear that.
Da tanzt wohl in der Hochzeit Reigen, die Herz allerliebste ein, die Herz allerliebste ein. Das ist ein Klingen und Dröhnen, das ist ein Klingen und Dröhnen, ein Pauken und ein Schallein. Dazwischen Schluchzen und Stöhnen, dazwischen Schluchzen und Stöhnen, die lieblichen Engelein.
So as you might have heard, he really makes a huge difference between using a lot of pedal in the parts, which are forte, where the trumpet is blaring, and also plays in a much more free way, with the hands not always quite lining up. So there's this kind of romantic effusion in these parts where it feels like the emotions of the singer are actually really coming to the fore. It's almost like the piano is providing some of the subtext, some of the emotional subtext for what the singer is feeling, even though his words are just about what he's hearing. playing. So the next song I want to play a little bit for you is the 10th one, and this is actually a perfect example of what I was talking about first, this kind of asynchronization between the left and right hands, the romantic idea of rubato. So here the right hand is delayed every time by a 16th note. And if you play it in, a very, very precise way with no extra kind of agogic accents or timing, you can really hear that it was notated this way. It doesn't sound like an improvisation. So again, a little bit from Jörg Demus's playing of this.
Das Liedchen klingen, das einst die Liebste sang. So will mir die Brust zerspringen von wildem Schmerzendrang.
Yeah, so there it is, and it sounds very... it's a very subtle thing, but do you notice how it kind of sounds? It sounds like it's, well, supposed to be that way. It sounds very precise, and you can kind of predict what's happening. But I think the point of that notation is quite the opposite, that we're supposed to be a little bit unsettled by the fact that the left and right hand are not lining up. So here's, again, an alternative way to do it. So I hope you don't mind that I'm letting the music do a lot of the talking. I, of course, put some notations in the score as well. I just love hearing this stuff, though. I love the freedom that Horowitz uses to treat this music. Not to say I would play it exactly the same way. No one should play it exactly the same way, but it's just the fact that he's taking this freedom and he's really trying to imagine as if he were making up the piece in the moment. And that's a wonderful kind of approach to take. That really makes the music alive in that moment. And I just wish more people would do that, especially when playing Schumann. You'll hardly ever hear that kind of freedom that he just exhibited. Even in solo pieces, it's rare to hear that. It's really only special artists who take that trouble to do that kind of thing. So I do encourage people to try to do this yourselves. Try to play in this kind of very, very free improvisational way. So I think I basically made my points. Really, you should just go and listen to the whole performance yourself because it is absolutely amazing. Try to get the text as well so you can read along with the translation into whatever your home language is, so you can really understand what's going on in the plot at the same time, because Schumann was a master of text setting and text painting, and he really does some marvelous things. Don't be put off by a few wrong notes here and there, as I was saying. Sometimes I even kind of like that because it just shows how kind of relaxed and how much fun they were having. At least it really sounds like Horowitz is having just a blast playing this piece, which, you know, he never really got the chance to do chamber music usually because his solo career was very successful and it was probably difficult to actually arrange things like that usually. But it just sounds like he's having fun and kind of making stuff up on the spot and being really inspired in the moment. So I think it's really inspiring, and even to this day, I still don't get tired of the recording. You know, warts and all, wrong notes, or little things that happen with the ensemble. It's still just such a special document of a remarkable moment in time and a remarkable collaboration. So I'm going to leave you with the last piece from the set as to sing us out here. This is probably also the longest one, the alten, bösen Lieder, the old evil songs. This is mainly remarkable for two things. One is the way that Horowitz is unashamed to use the full sound of the piano in certain passages, while at the same time not overshadowing the voice, but in places where there is room for it, he absolutely just clobbers the piano in a few parts in a good way, but also for the supreme sensitivity that he brings to the final postlude with the piano alone. I've heard this described as being almost an expression of, ah, well, better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. And I find it to be so tender and just wonderfully beautiful. And I think that this performance is particularly special in its singing freedom and, again, that kind of improvisatory feeling that we've been talking about all along. He takes many risks in his playing, just like Fischer-Dieskau takes with his singing. And you can argue maybe they don't all come off exactly the way he wanted them to, but it's still a wonderful attempt nonetheless, and one of my favorite interpretations of this final postlude. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you for your kind attention as always. I'll be back next week with some more music, some more conversation. Until then, take care, keep practicing, and I'll see you next time.
Die müssen noch stärker sein, als wie der starke König.